Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Macon Campbell and this is Making Stuff. So in today's video, this is what I'm going to be making. You could call this a robot. I'm calling it an android, but whatever you call it, this is what I ended up with. Now, how I went about this basically is I started off with a sculpt, as you can see over here, which is fairly high poly. If you have a look at this. Once I was done with that, I moved over to Re-Topology. This is my re-topologized mesh. Not the cleanest ever, but definitely better than the high poly. And after that, I moved over to refining the re-topology. And after that, obviously, jumped into texturing and ended up with this. And once I was done with that, I went ahead and I created just a simple pose here, looking towards the camera, and then I added some decals, as you can see here, and then I added some inserts, and that was basically it. If I didn't mention it before, this is the first time that I've ever tried to do something like this. I've played around with a bit of hard surface modeling. I've done a bit of sculpting a couple of years ago, but I haven't been doing that quite often recently. Hard surface sculpting is definitely something new to me, so I was definitely struggling a bit with that, but I tried to keep in all of the mistakes that I made, and as we go through the time lapse, I'll try and explain the issues that I ran into and how I sort of tried to overcome them. But for my first try, I think it looks good enough. And I think that if I had to do this again, I would most definitely be able to shave off probably around 5 hours of the time that it took me to make this. Now, if I add together all the video clips that I made for this project, it adds up to about 13-14 hours, and that excludes some of the parts that I cut out completely, because there were some parts where I just did really stupid shit and decided not to keep that in. But don't worry, there are still more than enough mistakes there that you can hopefully learn from. I certainly have. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so while we ease into the sculpting portion of this video, let me just quickly mention that in most of my other videos I do generally put background music in, but I've come to realize that I spend way too much time trying to figure out what music I'm going to put in my videos. So this time instead I decided to cut together a nice montage of nature sounds. So I hope you enjoy that. So let's get into it. Now there are a couple of different sculpting workflows in Blender. Personally over here I'm using Dyne-Topo or Dynamic Topology, but a problem that I was running into the whole time was that my Dynamic Topology kept on switching off randomly. So after doing a bit of research on YouTube, I found that because I started with a primitive, a cube in my case, the primitives usually have UV data attached to them. So because of that, the dynamic topology kept on bugging out. So I had to go to the UV maps under the object data, and I just had to delete that UV map data, and that seemed to fix my problem. So here I decide I want to create a sharp edge around this feature here, but for some reason I kept on using the wrong brush. Looking at the icons, that specific brush looked almost like it was the pinch brush, but that was actually the multi-scrape brush. But I did figure it out later. You'll also see me struggle a lot with the flatten brush. Now I've seen other people when they're sculpting, they'll create a crease and then they'll use the flatten brush on the one side of the crease to kind of flatten the mesh. But even though my brush is set to subtract, it just didn't feel like it was pushing into the mesh. So I wasn't really getting that recessed kind of look that I was going for. You'll see at one stage I even used the clay strips brush using control to press into the mesh and then smoothing it out. But eventually I figured out what the problem was. There's an auto smooth setting in the flatten brush that you have to set to 1 in order for it to work properly. So once I did that, I had a bit more joy out of the flatten brush. Here I quickly jumped into edit mode and turned on the statistics because I wanted to see how dense the mesh was, because my computer seemed to start lagging at this point. It seems for me the number of faces where my computer starts struggling is around 600,000 faces. Now I have an add-on called HardOps installed, and in their queue menu there's an option for decimate, and if you just select that, then it will decimate the model by around 25%. So I had to do that occasionally to keep my computer running smoothly. So here I wanted to kind of extrude out this particular region of the mesh, and you can do that by masking it and then using the mesh filter tool to kind of extrude that out. But for some reason I couldn't get it to work properly, so eventually I just used the clay strips brush to build up that region. Later I figured out that the reason it wasn't working properly is because the filter type was set to inflate. That's why it was giving such an ugly result. So here I wanted to add like eyes or cameras or whatever you want to call it, and instead of extruding them out of the mesh, I decided to add them as separate objects. So I just brought in these cylinders over here, and once I got the shape that I was looking for, then I used the boolean to mesh it together, and then using dynamic topology, then I sort of fused the meshes together. Now around this point I needed to decimate the mesh again, and then I suddenly ran into a problem that gave me quite a bit of issues. It seems for some reason once I decimate the mesh I couldn't undo it. So as you can see over here, when I decimated the mesh, it kind of messed up those cylinders that I merged with the original geometry, and for some reason I couldn't get that undone. I was at the point where I was going to try and fix it by sculpting. But eventually by jumping between object mode, edit mode, sculpt mode, and undoing in all of these different modes, eventually I got the decimate undone. But the problem was it took me like 10 steps back, so a lot of the changes that I already made I had to redo again. Now I don't know if this is how it's supposed to be or if this is just a bug in 3.3. I've noticed a whole lot of people complaining about 3.3 not being very stable. But I learned my lesson, so every time I did a decimate I just saved the file beforehand. And there were a couple of times where that came in handy because my mesh got ruined a couple of times and I had to close out Blender and then reopen my last saved file so that I could get that mesh back. So this was pretty much the final shape that I went for. So then I just went ahead and added a couple more details here and there to make it look a little bit more interesting. Now I'm just quickly adding a camera into the scene because I like to take progress renders while I'm busy with the project so that I can look back at the progress that I've made since the beginning of the project. Here I'm just creating a copy of the sculpt and I'm dropping that in my backup collection just in case I need it in the future. So I had to decimate again, but I decided I was going to try the Decimate Modifier so that I could have a bit more control over how it decimates the model. I initially tried unsubdivide, but Blender kept on hanging and eventually it actually crashed. So I tried again using collapse and that seemed to work a whole lot better. So this here was a bit of an afterthought. I wanted something coming out of the side of the head for lighting or something like that. This was a bit of a struggle to sculpt. In hindsight, I think I should have just added this as a separate object, just like I did with the eyes. But it is what it is. I got it done in the end. So with that, I've gone about as far as I'm willing to go with the sculpt, and now it's time to start with Re-Topology. So I'm using a basic manual Re-Topology workflow using a shrink wrap modifier and face snapping. Now initially I was struggling a little bit with face snapping because when I selected more than one vertex to snap, it sort of wanted to merge them together. So there are two important settings that you need to activate to get it to work properly. The first one is align rotation to target, and the other more important one is project individual elements. Here I'm just giving the Re-Topo mesh a different color in the viewport so that I can distinguish it a little bit better from the sculpted mesh. Now at the moment I have the Re-Topo mesh set to display in front of all other objects in the object properties viewport display, because the shrink wrap modifier sort of sucks it into the mesh that it's being shrink wrapped to. At the moment it comes in pretty handy, but later when I start retopologizing the back of the mesh, then it sort of becomes a problem. So then I sort of switched it off and I just kind of dealt with the mesh being sucked into the sculpt. It was pretty slow going here in the beginning, but the deeper I got into the Re-Topology, the quicker I got at it. Now I'm also not worrying too much about the flow of the topology here. I'm just sort of trying to get everything covered, because I'm going to come back eventually and I'm going to start refining the mesh and the flow of the topology later. Now as you can see, initially I'm creating all of these separate parts as one object, because later I'm going to come back and then I will separate everything by loose parts. But for now, keeping it all as one object just makes it easier for me to jump back and forth between different parts and work on them individually. Now I know for some people watching Re-Topology can become really old really quick, so I'm going to bump up the speed a little bit until the Re-Topology is over. At the moment we're playing back at about 12 times speed, so I'm going to bump it up to 20 times and then we'll check back once the Re-Topology is done. So it's around here where viewing the Re-Topo in front of everything else becomes a bit of a problem, because it kind of obscures my view when I'm busy trying to model at the back here. So you'll see me turn that setting off here and there just to get this retopo done. You'll see me occasionally throw a subsurf on there just so that I can sort of get an idea of what it's going to look like subdivided. Now I'm not planning on having any subdivisions active on the model once it's done. Whatever subdivision modifiers I do add are probably all going to be applied, and when I apply them they're going to be applied at a maximum level of 1. Because I don't want too much geometry. As for the rest, it's just going to be smoothed, and I'll be using creases to sharpen the sharp edges, and I'll use bevel modifiers wherever possible to ease those sharp edges. Now, this is not a workflow that I've come up with myself. I've pretty much stolen this directly from Master Xeon, who is, as far as I know, the creator of the hard ops and box cutter add-ons. I've watched a couple of his YouTube videos where he's sculpted and modeled robots like this, obviously much better than this. And during the making of this model, I had to go back and re-watch some of his videos quite a few times. Some of the things that he was doing in his videos, I just couldn't get to work in my project. Now, even though I couldn't execute all of the stunts that he pulled in his videos, I did manage to stumble through it, and obviously I learned quite a lot through the whole process. So here I'm starting to spot some undesirable topology, which unfortunately has to be fixed before I can carry on with these back pieces. Now, some parts like this over here, I'm not even actually going to use in the final model, as this particular part I'm going to model a pipe that I'm going to stick in there, but I'm just modeling it anyway for the retopo, just in case there's elements there that I need. As I always say, I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. As I start rounding out this retopo, you can probably start noticing that there are a bunch of major gaps between all of these panels. Now that is definitely something that came back to bite me in the arse, because I spent probably an hour or two trying to close all of those gaps. So moving forward, when I do another project like this, firstly in the sculpt stage, I'm definitely going to make much smaller creases, and then when it comes to the retopo, I'll definitely have much smaller gaps between all of these panels. But whichever way you look at it, in a project like this, you're bound to have to do a ton of manual manipulation of vertices anyway. But through planning and optimizing your workflow, I guess the aim is just to try and minimize as much of that manipulation as possible. So this is about as far as I decided to go with the retopo. As for the shoulders, I decided to just add in spheres and manipulate them to work. Thought that'd be easier. And then as you can see over here, for those gas cans on the side of his face, I decided to just model them and then stick them in there, and then kind of manipulate the geometry around it to fit to the cylinders. So here I'm starting to model what will become the pipe running up the back of his neck. As you can see, I'm just modeling one section of it, and then I'm using an array to create the rest of it. I'll then apply that array, and then using a lattice, I'll sort of deform it to fit into place. Now, I haven't used the lattice in years, so you'll see me struggle a bit here, but I eventually got it to work. So once again, I'll create another copy to put in my backup collection. I always like to keep backups of my model at varying stages of completion, so that if I have to go back and change something major, then at least I have a backup to fall back on. As you can see, I'm starting to add some base materials because the suspense is killing me. I just really want to get an idea of what the end product is going to look like. This also helps to give me a little bit of motivation to carry on, because up until this point, there was probably like 3 or 4 times that I nearly decided to just call it quits, delete this model, and just start something else. So it was around here that most of my headaches began. So I wanted to add thickness to all of these pieces, and also wanted to add bevels, sharpness to the edges, and I also wanted to put subsurf on it to smooth out the mesh. But no matter which order that I put all of these modifiers in, the result just kept on looking like crap. So after quite a lot of struggles, I just decided to carry on with something that didn't require too much brain power. So I went ahead and I started closing up all of the gaps that I was talking about earlier. But you'll see me jump back to that specific piece quite a few times because I'm watching videos in between to try and figure out how to get this to work properly. So here it looks like I'm going through all of the other objects one by one and adding all of those modifiers to try and figure out which objects are going to give me the most problems in terms of shading and artifacts. And throughout all of this, it seems like the parts that gave me the most issues were those two domed pieces on the top of the head. For some reason, the shading on them just looked horrible no matter what I did, especially on the inside corners. I kept on getting artifacts in those areas. So here I am back on this bloody dome again, moving modifiers up and down the stack, changing parameters and trying to get a good result. As soon as I end up with something that looks relatively okay, I decide to just move on with closing those gaps again. I think it's very important when you get stuck like this not to keep banging your head into the same brick wall. Sometimes it's better just to move on to something else and then come back a little bit later with fresh eyes and a fresh mind. And occasionally that will help you come up with new plans and new ideas for the same problem. Now, at the moment, for the most part, you still see me moving vertices around one by one, especially where I need them to fit along a curve. But later on, you'll see me start using an add-on that I learned about from watching Master Xion's video. The add-on is called Mirror Tools, which allows you to select a whole row of vertices, and then using a tool called Curve Stretch, you can select how many anchor points you have along that curve, and then by adjusting those anchor points you can get a really nice curve or perfectly straight lines as well, and that really helped a lot. So I decided to take a break from closing these gaps, and here I am back on this dome. But this time I decided that in order to fix this piece, I think the first thing that I need to do is sort out the topology, because it is extremely messy. And as you'll see here, I spent way more time than I care to admit trying to fix this topology, and even after all that time I still don't really think it turned out that well. But at the end of the day, you've got to know when to quit. I could have spent many more hours trying to fix this, but eventually I just went with what I had. As you can see, I'm trying to create a perimeter edge around this whole piece, because I'm hoping that by doing that, that is going to sort out some of the shading and artifacts that I have around the edge. Eventually I realized I was an idiot, because I could have created that edge loop by using inset. Nonetheless, still good practice. At this stage you can probably see that I already have my mirror modifier applied. I'm just making changes to the one side of the mesh, and then occasionally you'll see me mirror the changes across to the other side using Mesh Machine add-on. So this is about as far as I decide to go with the cleanup of this mesh. What I did here is I put a subsurf modifier on the mesh and then I applied it. And here I am using mirror tools to try and straighten out these edges again. But then pretty quickly I realized that this was going to take too long. So I went and undid all of this. And then what I did is I used a crease to sharpen all the corners before I applied the subsurf modifier. That way I had a lot less cleanup to do. Here I decide to make a couple of changes to this dome at the top before I carry on. Okay, so it looks like I wasn't quite ready to carry on with that piece just yet, so here I am closing up some more gaps. Okay, so it looks like I'm ready to take on this dome again. Here you can see me adding those creases that I mentioned earlier. And when I apply that subsurf modifier, you can see that those sharp edges stay sharp in the subdivided mesh. Then I just went ahead and removed some of the edges that I didn't think were necessary. You'll also see me struggling quite a bit with the symmetry here and there, because it seems like right in the beginning when I started the Re-Topo mesh, I used the Sculpt as the mirror object. Now I don't know if I accidentally moved the Re-Topo mesh or if I moved the Sculpt mesh, but that caused the symmetry of all my objects to be a little bit off kilter. And because this whole Re-Topo mesh started out as one object, I had this problem for all the objects. So before I started working on each of the objects, I had to go through and reset all of their origins and reapply the mirror so that I could get them to work properly. Now you'll see me applying the same workflow to almost all of the pieces. I start out by applying the mirror modifier, and then I do an inset so I can get a perimeter edge around the whole part, and then I use the edges running into each of the corners to sharpen it. And I put on a subsurf modifier of level 1, apply it, and then once I have that, then I add a solidify modifier followed by a bevel modifier, and then I move on to the next piece, all the while continuously closing gaps wherever I happen to find them. Now I had my solidify modifier set to rim only, which means that only the edge is extruded out. And in this particular piece you can see that it's extruding the wrong way, so obviously my normals were flipped. So I just went through the entire mesh. As you can see, I had a ton of normals that were facing the wrong direction, so I just went ahead and fixed them. It's around here where you see me use the Mirror Tools add-on that I mentioned for the first time, and it is really an awesome add-on. It's also a free add-on, so I'd recommend that anyone who wants it to go and get it. I think I found it on the Blender Artist forum. For pretty much all of the other pieces, the bevel modifier that I had added was set to angle, and for all of those pieces it worked fine. But for this particular piece it kept on catching all the wrong angles. I tried to adjust the angles as much as I could, but I just couldn't get it to work properly. At some point I kind of just gave up, but later I came back and then I changed the bevel modifier to bevel weight, and that way I could use bevel weights on the edges to assign where I wanted those bevels to be applied. So all the rest of the pieces are getting pretty much the same treatment here, so I'm going to bump up the speed to 20 times again, and I'll check back again once we get to the next part. Around here I discovered that I could actually add a crease to a vertex. Up until this point I thought that I could only add creases to edges. That is why I was insetting all of the meshes so that I could have an edge running into each of the corners. So just there alone I could have saved myself a lot of time by just creasing the vertices in the corners instead of creating edges leading to each corner. Now, even though I made this great discovery for all of the rest of the parts, I still carried on using the same workflow that I'd been using for all of the other pieces, simply because it was working, and also I wasn't sure whether that edge would stay sharp once I applied the subsurf modifier on these other pieces. So just for interest's sake, while I'm editing this video, I just quickly popped into Blender just to test it, and I can confirm that yes, when you crease a vertex and you apply a subsurf modifier over it, that corner does stay sharp. Now for this particular piece I couldn't do an inset like I did with all of the others because of that protruding part in the middle. So I had to cut in that inset using the knife tool, and I had to do a bit of cleanup. In hindsight, I think it might have been a better idea to just separate that protruding part into a new mesh, and I think that might have given me a better result. Okay, so that's the bulk of the cleanup done. Now I'm just going and refining a couple of things, adding some details, like this light over here. Here I discovered this plate on the back of the head that I completely forgot about, so I had to go and fix that quickly. Here I take the time to quickly create another backup, and then I carry on adding a couple more smaller details. So I decided I want to have a cut going through this shoulder piece, so I just created this object that I can use a difference boolean to cut through that. And obviously that leaves me a bit of cleanup to do, which I did. Although it's a really small change and it cost me a whole lot of work, it does add a little bit of extra visual interest, which is good. Once I was done with that, I wasn't really liking this transition between the shoulder plate and these neck and chest pieces. So I copied over this edge from one of the shoulder pieces and I converted it to a curve and gave that some thickness. So I have a kind of a bead covering up that transition. But more tweaking here and there. Here I decided to add some more details to these cans. Create another backup, of course, and then it's time to try and give it a bit of a pose. Now off camera I did try to do this with an armature, but because there are so many individual pieces it didn't work that well. So luckily you can go into edit mode on multiple objects. So I just selected all of the objects and selected the head, and then using proportional editing I was able to tilt the head a little bit, and while it's not an extremely dynamic pose, it's definitely a lot better than the basic static pose that I had. And now it's finally time to start adding some decals, and this is definitely my favorite part because it really starts to bring everything together. Now I create all of my decals myself in Illustrator, and I export them as PNGs with a transparent background. I import them as planes into Blender, and then because I'm adding them to curved surfaces, I have to subdivide the plane a bit, and then I also add a subsurf modifier on top of that, and then I use a shrink wrap modifier to stick it to the mesh. So to add a bit more visual interest, I decided I wanted to add a bit of a material texture to some of these neck pieces. I haven't done this in a while, so I had to definitely brush up on my texturing skills a bit, but I managed to get it done in the end. Now, when I created these textures, I forgot that these materials were applied to other objects as well. So I had to separate out this material and then go and fix all the others that I had ruined. So at this point I realized that I'd totally forgotten to add in smaller details like bolts and stuff like that. So this was a bit of an afterthought, but I went and added in some of these anyway, and I think at least it made a bit of a difference. I would have liked to have cut indents into the meshes for these bolts to sit in. I think that would look nice, but this video is already taking so long, so I'm just going to place them on top of the mesh and be done with it. Okay, with that guys, we're done, and I for one am pretty damn stoked on how that turned out, especially considering that this is the first time that I've done something like this. I've definitely tested a lot of my skills, and I'm excited to see how this is going to benefit my modeling and my workflow in the future. So with that said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, go ahead and hit that thumbs up. If you have any questions about this model and my workflow and what I did here that I didn't make clear in the voiceover, feel free to drop that in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer that as best as I can. If you have any suggestions for videos that you would like me to do in the future, you're also welcome to share those. And then I guess I'll see you in the next project. So till next time, keep making stuff.